Hello, my name is Johnston. My childhood was very challenging. I lived in California, near LA, where we had a lot of smog. But inside LA, we had a very rich culture, which we had tons of museums that involved movies, dance, theater. I was constantly exposed to all of these different ideas. My parents are both hearing, so it was hard for us to communicate. We often wrote back and forth to each other. My parents really encouraged me to go to the different museums to take in all of the art and theater so that I was exposed to different types of vocabulary. It was really hard for me to communicate with my dad, but growing up, I didn't really realize that communication was a problem. I didn't have any brothers and sisters, so I grew up as an only child. As a child, I had tons of different ideas, and I considered my toys to be my brothers. I had a bunch of toy soldiers that I would line up and pretend to have a war. I would set them up and use my soldiers to create a war scene. This really helped get my imagination going. Growing up, I never realized that I was deaf. I looked at myself and noticed that everyone else looked exactly like me. I looked up to a lot of hearing adults, and I assumed that one day, when I got older, I would be able to hear as well. I had some friends when I was younger that were hearing, and I just assumed that they had developed their hearing faster than I had. There's one moment in my childhood that I will never forget. My friend, he tried to teach me how to say numbers. And I was so excited. I could count to 10. And I went back to my parents' house and I showed them that I was able to say my numbers. They clapped for me and I was so excited, but then that's when I realized that this was a form of oppression. Growing up, I didn't really understand the value of being human. I went to college, and that's when I started to really understand who I was. At college, I learned about different deaf artists, and that's when I really realized who I was. As I was growing up, I tried to figure out what I wanted to do when I got older. I really had no idea. I liked to draw, I liked to write, and dance, and act, but I knew that I couldn't be an actor. But then I realized that my attitude was the problem. I was always telling myself that I couldn't do things. I would always wish that I could do things, but then I would tell myself that I couldn't. And I just learned to accept the fact that I couldn't do things. When I got to college, I had 3 different professors, and they all helped encourage me to follow after my dreams. But still, I would always feel oppress. But the only way for me to overcome that oppression was for me to believe that I could do things, to have an open mind and push my way through. As I grew up, as I was growing up, I realized that I depended on other people to make decisions for me. But once I got to college, I realized it was time for me to make my own decisions. I went to college. I went to NTID, the Deaf Institute. I was often put in a hearing classroom with an interpreter. A lot of the students that were in my classes had never experienced deaf culture, and they were more focused on their artwork. So I didn't have time to educate them about my deaf culture. I worked my way through classes, put a smile on my face, and tried to have a positive attitude. And that gave me more confidence in myself, and I felt more independent. Once I graduated that, I went to RIT. Everyone there had grown up in the deaf community, grew up signing, and always being around people who were deaf. After I graduated, I realized I was living in a community where there was no deaf culture. I was out in the hearing world. After graduating, I sat down and I tried to figure out who I was as an artist. I decided that I would go to Penn State University. The fall of my senior year, I started thinking about what I would do after graduating. I realized that I needed to do things without help. I needed to do this without help from other people. So I went to the library and checked out a bunch of different books about colleges. As I looked through the books, I realized that I needed to make a decision on to where I was going to go. And this was really a good experience for me, and I really felt independent. I applied to 8 different schools, and only maybe one of those schools accepted me. The other 7 denied me. A few months later, a second college accepted me, and now I was forced to make a decision. I decided I was going to major in furniture design and woodworking at RIT. Some people ask me why I would want to choose that, and I really chose that because I wanted to go somewhere where I wanted to do something where I could have fun and really enjoy what I was doing, and improve myself and have a better attitude. Before, I used to take classes that would introduction to psychology, different introductory classes that I really didn't enjoy. And while I was taking those classes, I learned that there's a huge variety of people. Black, white, Chinese, all different types of people, but we're still all human beings. We're all the same. I told all my deaf friends that I decided I was going to go to Penn State, and they couldn't believe it. They told me that it was going to be really challenging, and that I wouldn't be able to survive in the hearing world. They reminded me that there wasn't very many deaf people there, and it would be really hard for me to communicate with them, with the hearing people. But I decided that I wanted to test myself and see how I could survive within the hearing world and make friends without needing people to help assist me all the time. So my first day at Penn State, I walked out of my bedroom and I instantly realized that this was not a deaf community. This was a hearing school. It was a very urban area, and I realized that no one there knew anything about deafness or deaf culture. But it was one thing I needed to get used to. I always brought a pencil and paper with me everywhere I went so that I could communicate with people. I kept it in my front pocket. I kind of looked like a nerd. So my first day I was out walking, carrying my books through campus. People were passing by, and I opened up a map. It kind of looked like I was at a survival camp or something. Someone came up to me. They could tell that I looked confused, and I wrote down on a note trying to figure out where the registrar's office is. It was kind of frustrating having this conversation with people, and I was trying to tell them that I wanted to withdraw from a class. I thought I couldn't survive and that I wanted to withdraw, so I needed to get a withdrawal form. But I didn't know where to find that form. So I went to the registrar's office. I made it there, and I realized maybe I could survive this. Maybe just for 1 year. When I got to the office, everyone looked scared. They didn't know how to handle interacting with a deaf person. I allowed them to understand my handicap, and eventually they felt comfortable with me. A lot of deaf people complain that communication is a huge issue within the world. But it's really important that you find a way to deal with that problem and think about it positively. It's important for deaf people to take up classes that help them understand deaf culture better. And then you'll have a better experience, and you'll be able to have a successful communication. I kind of feel like my entire life I was sleeping until I made it to college, when I finally woke up and realized what was all included with deaf culture. So I went for 1 year in the master's program and decided to go back to NTIG for theater. I thought that I could maybe teach theater, but then I wasn't sure if that was really what I wanted to do. but I really had a passion, a big heart for theater. So I went to my advisor at Penn State. We sat down and talked about exactly what I should do with my future. I explained my dreams and how I wanted to help people, be a deaf artist, do some research in history, and really analyze deaf artists' work. Yes, maybe they suggested I would enter their PhD program, and that way I could teach art students in the PhD program. I was reading an article by one of my favorite deaf artists, and he actually taught a hearing class about art. And I thought maybe I could do that as well. So then I decided that I would apply for that PhD program at Penn State. Penn State accepted me, and I entered their program. So I entered the PhD program. I felt more confident already. I felt really good. All the other teachers were hearing, and so, but I rolled up my sleeves and was ready to get to work. I had a lot of emotion and felt really positive about what I was doing. Without that, I would never have survived. With the motivation that I had, I was able to survive that program. At Penn State, they don't have supportive services for deaf people. They didn't have interpreters, and it was really a challenge to find. I advertised in the college newspaper for an interpreter, and I would often ask people, but it was really hard to find. And Penn State wasn't always willing to pay for an interpreter. And sometimes it was tough to match up my schedule with other interpreters as well. And there was 3 or 4 interpreters, but they really didn't know the art background, so they had to create new signs for vocabulary that matched my curriculum. I started doing an independent study, and so I sat down with the hearing teacher and we wrote notes back and forth to communicate. A few of my teachers actually learned some sign language. So it was my first day of class, and when I entered the classroom, I was the first one there. I got there super early. My teacher wrote his name really big on the blackboard. I sat down and waited for the other students to come in until the classroom was filled. There was probably 30 or 40 students in the classroom at that time. I was kind of nervous because I knew that they were all hearing and I was the only deaf student. I waited for the interpreter, and I was really dependent on the interpreter, so I started getting nervous when the interpreter wasn't showing up. My teacher started drawing a picture of someone's face on the board, and everyone started laughing. I started gesturing and writing on the blackboard. I passed out papers and started writing on the board. So a lot of people left the room, and there was only about 10 people. They left. So 2 days later, there was about 40 people in the classroom again. There There was about 10 people standing outside of the classroom begging to come in. 45 students in the class at this point. So finally, an interpreter showed up. I was kind of nervous, but I told my students they had 3 different ways to communicate with me. They could talk to the interpreter. You could learn sign language, for example, finger spelling. I had different cards that I could pass out to them. Or they could just write back and forth. Most of the class preferred to use the interpreter, and some of them decided to write back and forth.